My name is Nick Jones. I am the founder of the Society for Esoteric and Entheogenic Knowledge, or S.E.E.K. You can find us at JoinSeek.org. We are on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, X at JoinSeek1, and on YouTube, Patreon, Ko-Fi, Reddit at JoinSeek. Esoteric comes from the Greek esoterikos. It means inner, as in the knowledge reserved for the inner circle. This encompasses traditions like Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, alchemy, Rosicrucianism, and beyond. Entheogenic likewise comes from Greek roots. It means generating the divine within, referring to visionary plants and fungi across global spiritual history that enable this capacity. Today, I am joined by Dennis Walker. Dennis Walker is an entrepreneur, educator, and founder of Mycopreneur, one of the leading educational platforms dedicated to mushroom cultivation, fungal science, and the responsible advancement of medicinal and entheogenic fungi. Throughout years of research, cultivation, consulting, and public education, Dennis has helped thousands of people better understand the biology, history, and practical cultivation of mushrooms while advocating for scientific literacy, ethical stewardship, and accessible education. His work bridges traditional mycological knowledge with modern research, making him an important voice in the growing global conversation surrounding fungi, consciousness, ecology, and human health. So welcome, Dennis. Thank you for joining me. I look forward to our discussion.
Well, thanks so much, Nick, for that generous introduction. You didn't need to do all that for little old me. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm looking forward to getting into it together.
Well, thank you again, and with that, let's get going. The first question: few organisms have influenced human civilization quite as profoundly as fungi. They decompose forests, recycle nutrients, build symbiotic relationships with more than 90% of terrestrial plants through mycorrhizal networks, produce antibiotics such as penicillin, contribute to food production through fermentation, and provide compounds now being studied for mental health applications. Throughout history, mushrooms have also occupied important places within numerous cultures, including the mushroom stones of ancient Guatemala, the Mazatec veladas of Oaxaca, Siberian shamanic spiritual systems, possible mushroom imagery in prehistoric rock art, and the ethno-mycological investigations of R. Gordon Wasson, Roger Heim, Richard Evans Schultes, Albert Hofmann, Paul Stamets, and many others. Few organisms occupy such a remarkable place at the intersection of ecology, medicine, anthropology, and religious history. So, for someone who has dedicated so much of their life to fungi, what was it about mushrooms that first captivated your imagination, and why do you think they continue to fascinate both scientists and spiritual seekers alike?
Hey, great overview there, Nick. And first off, I think a lot of people don't really recognize what fungi bring to the table. And they bring a lot to the table. I think they've kind of persisted and lived and evolved in a blind spot for a lot of people. Because for me, growing up, fungi, mushrooms, I didn't even know the word fungi, like you maybe heard it in the background, but mushrooms were the funky little things at the salad bar or the thing on your pizza that you peel off your pizza. And it wasn't until I had my first proper experience with the entheogenic fungi. You mentioned the word entheogen, right? Which actually, I feel like we need a new word for fungi, because entheogen, I think, primarily applies to plants. I guess it's like revealing the God within. And I actually have got to spend time with Jonathan Ott, who co-coined that term, and he passed away last year. But I wanted to mention that when you said entheogen. And so a lot of people just don't recognize what fungi actually are and what they can be. And for example, I think that there's an estimated, off the top of my head, like several million different types of fungi, and only about 2% have been identified. Only a handful have been identified. We're finding new ones all the time. When people go out on forays, we're finding new psychoactive fungi all the time. And so what first really endeared me to the fungi genus or to the species is a psychoactive mushroom experience, right? Is experiencing psilocybin mushrooms and thinking, holy guacamole, this stuff is so different than how, psychedelics were portrayed to me. And after that experience when I was 17, it really opened up my curiosity and intrigue into this kingdom at large. And now we're starting to see rightfully a lot of innovation and a lot of partnership between humanity and fungi. We're seeing it all across the board. We're seeing fungi, not just psychedelic fungi, we're seeing fungi used for materials. People are, not just people, but like companies like Hermes, and I think Louis Vuitton has done stuff, Adidas, Stella McCartney, like you could just keep naming brands. They've all invested in certain types of fungi for fashion purposes, for materials. NASA has invested in fungi technology, Mercedes-Benz. You go down this rabbit hole and you see, whoa, there's a lot of huge potential and active use of these different fungi for different industrial and research purposes and applications. So once you start kind of pulling on that thread, you see that there's a lot. Like, for example, in Oakland, there was a 300-unit apartment building that was used. It was like mycelium was used, which is the root structure of fungi, right? Like you have a tree, you have roots with fungi. It's actually just the kind of fruiting body, or the sexual organ is the mushroom, but the real organism is underground, is this filament network of fibers of mycelium. And you can use those for all kinds of stuff. So between the whole organism, it's not just materials, it's not just mental health, it's not just the psychoactive fungi, it's not just food. You also see them used in like building materials. You see them used in even fuel sources. Like there's investigations going on with like fungi for fuel. I did an article a while ago where I went down the rabbit hole where there's 27 sustainable development goals with the United Nations. It's a huge project. There's $4 trillion committed. All 191 or 92 UN member states are committed to these sustainable development goals by 2030. And fungi address most of them. And that just shows that there's a huge amount of interest in what can these things do. So to fully round out that conversation, for me, it was my first psychedelic experience, which I'm super happy to talk about, and I often do. And then also, it was just recognizing this huge untapped potential for an advanced intelligence. That's what it comes down to. When people are like, why are you so interested in mushrooms? To me, mushrooms are far more interesting than a UFO or like, you know, the grays of the species. I'm sure that some other intelligent species exist in the universe, but the ones that have come across my desk are mushrooms. They're an advanced intelligence. We barely figured out what we can even do with them. And I don't think they're just an inert substance. I think it's an intelligence you can partner with. The same way like you partner with a mentor, or you find somebody who's very intelligent and you build a team together. Mushrooms are that for me and for a lot of people.
That was a beautiful introduction. And I know in the Pacific Northwest, the largest organism on Earth is this mycelial network, this giant mushroom. It's fascinating just across history. Beyond the psychoactive mushrooms like you described, there's also lion's mane, cordyceps, turkey tail, all these medicinal mushrooms that have been utilized across the globe for centuries, millennia. On the psychoactive side, you can go back to Bernardino de Sahagún, the Florentine Codex describing the Aztec use of Teonanacatl. You have authors like John Uri Lloyd and Etta Dorpa. His brother, Curtis Gates Lloyd, was a mycologist, and allegedly that was inspired by psychoactive mushroom use. Early in the 20th century, you have stories like Monsieur Among the Mushrooms in the Irish Ecclesiastical Record, describing this allegedly nonfiction story where this cult gathers around this figure who's interested in visionary experience induced by the mushrooms. And so it's hinted that maybe that story is also inspired by psychoactive mushrooms. And then on into the 50s, you see R. Gordon Wasson going to Maria Sabina, introducing the Western world through the Life magazine, Seeking the Magic Mushroom article. After that, Albert Hofmann, the scientist who created LSD, synthesizing and isolating the compounds therein and providing psilocin and psilocybin in the form of medicinal capsules. So the history is so long, the impacts are so great. It really set off the 1960s, the psychedelic era, all of the research that was being done with psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, mescaline, and the like. You did talk about your first psilocybin mushroom trip. I was just wondering, when you were 17, what happened? What kind of revelations did you have? Did you have any kind of geometric vision overlays, or how would you describe it?
I love talking about this. First off, I briefly want to address, I think it's interesting and not often discussed, that Timothy Leary, his first experience with psychedelics was with psilocybin mushrooms in Cuernavaca. So like, you know, somebody who arguably had a massive influence, but arguably kicked off the psychedelic era of the 60s. It wasn't LSD, even though that's what he's known for. It was actually him going to Cuernavaca, Mexico, and having a ancestral traditional psilocybin mushroom experience. So I think that often doesn't get discussed. But in terms of my first foray into the world of mushrooms, it was very much casual, recreational format and context that I was introduced in. And that's also one reason I advocate for people to not just have to do this in super strict settings. Like I had my first experience at a county fair with 4 friends. And fortunately, I was in a place where I had kind of read about them. I wasn't going in blind. I was with friends I had smoked weed with. I was in a good place at a good time in my life. And I took a small dose, which I'm also an advocate of: go low, start slow, go low, go slow, right? Like you don't need to be taking these huge doses your first time. I think it's important that hopefully you get the real experience, you get a taste of it, but not taking on more than you bargained for. And that was the case for me. As it was 2006, and I had a 1.7 gram dose of golden teachers. So that's a half-eighth, as we call it, right? Which is like pretty small. Some people would call that a museum dose or a recreational dose. Around the therapeutic threshold, which actually now I guess there's a definition in Colorado where there's a kind of emerging legal industry of a therapeutic dose. So I say that to say it's way more than a microdose, but it's not a dose that's going to knock you on your ass, right? You're hopefully for most people going to be able to function on it. That was my case. And that's what really blew my mind, is that I took this dose and at no point did I feel like it was too much or too intense. It was beautiful. It felt like it adapted to me, right? And in terms of geometric patterns or visuals, at that point, I didn't have any visuals. I did have them in a subsequent trip at a 3.5 gram dose. I had my first geometric visuals, but what I really experienced at 1.7 grams was this sense of opening the imagination, opening the senses, the sense of being connected to the environment, being fully present, not being in my mind, being very aware of my body, but feeling good in my body, right? Not feeling this awkwardness or this heaviness. It was this sense almost like I would compare it to like I was swimming through the atmosphere, and it felt really good. And I remember really locking into this experience, seeing live music. I saw a band called Ozo Motley play. They're a great Latin jazz band. And everything about it that first time was that it was very mellow, but at the same time, opened my eyes, opened my mind to the potential of what was going on here. And probably the most important part, I had this sense of ecstasy, like people describe and say, what is ecstasy? It's this sense of completeness of this is a full moment. This is me here, not thinking about what happened before, what's coming next, but I'm right here. The sun's setting, the music's playing. I feel really in my body. And the whole takeaway from it was I felt very safe, very comfortable, very inspired. I think that's an understatement. Like the inspiration part, I remember probably the peak of what was happening. The sun was setting. I just seen the opening band play. I was waiting for Ozo Motley, and I was standing next to these huge speakers, like these monitors next to the stage, and the song Idiotech by Radiohead came on. Blew my mind, right? Where just like it wasn't just listening to music, it was being consumed by it. It's so stereotypical to talk about like, oh man, I was one with the music, but that's what happened. And the biggest takeaway was that I felt very safe. I didn't have any kind of freak out moment. I didn't have any kind of hangover the next day. And what I did have the next day was like, I got to learn more about this stuff. I got to learn more. Why did I feel so alive, so inspired, so happy? I was connecting with my friends off of this like tiny dose of mushrooms. And it just completely defied any expectations for me. And this was, again, 2006. So it's kind of before the whole, now that I do like to make satire, which hopefully we can get into, because I think now there's a lot of people broadcasting about this. There's a lot of people discussing it, and that's good on one hand. On the other hand, I think people should experience it themselves without having all these preconceived expectations and notions. And I really didn't have any of those when I started. So I feel like I got a very pure experience, and I'm grateful that I got to do it then. And now I'm curious how it would have impacted me if I did it the first time in 2026, when it's way more of a thing now. It was not really a big thing when I got into it. It was like whispers, I heard about it for a while, friends of friends, and then it comes across your path. But again, like there was no psychedelic renaissance. There were no companies. There was no way to study at university. You could not speak about it openly. So it's changed so much in the 20 years since I first had it, for better and for worse.
Thank you for sharing. And across global spiritual history, whether it's esoteric or entheogenic systems, you do see this contrast of belief versus gnosis or direct experience, and often this idea of belief and these preconceived notions that we form because of what authority figures tell us, what institutions tell us. They can kind of drive the idea that we have surrounding either esoteric and entheogenic practices. And it's not until you have the direct experience that you really truly understand where these notions were misconceived, where they did align, but maybe not give the full picture. And also across global spiritual history, we see this idea of unio mystica, or this mystical union with God that occurs with entheogenic states or an esoteric initiation, contemplative practice. Plato described it as theomania or divine madness, and these states that are outside of our sensory realm, our sensory awareness, that we can tap into this subconscious, beyond superconscious realm that impacts our reality in more ways than we can fathom. And so I think it's fascinating. And then just going back, Terence McKenna, I know he's a big figure in the space, and a lot of people come to know about psilocybin and fungi through his writings, his lectures. He did describe how evolutionarily he believed that psilocybin was one of the first organisms that inhabited Earth. Before forests, there were giant mushrooms that were just covering the surface. And he thought that humanity's early relationship with these fungi over the hundreds of thousands of years we evolved culminated in this stoned ape theory, where consciousness evolved. We came into knowledge of the arts, of the spiritual self, of language. And through that evolution, humanity was able to tap into this deeper truth beyond our Maya, the illusion in Hinduism, or any kind of non-direct experience of reality that maybe we were having prior to these intense states. He also does describe this heroic journey of this 5 grams complete darkness alone. And most people, they think that that has to be their introduction to a psilocybin mushroom experience. And I'm glad that you pointed toward that. Sometimes these museum doses or these lighter doses are a great introduction. They provide a lot of stimulation in terms of thought. They provide a lot of oneness, interconnectedness that allow one to glimpse the experience without being overcome by the anxieties or fears that some people describe as dictating psychedelic or entheogenic experience. So I appreciate you sharing that. Moving to the next question. Cultivating mushrooms requires understanding ecological relationships rather than imposing complete control over nature. Variables such as substrate composition, temperature, humidity, gas exchange, microbial competition, and seasonal rhythms all influence successful cultivation. Historically, many agricultural and spiritual systems viewed successful cultivation as a partnership between humanity and the natural world, rather than domination over it. Similar attitudes appear within indigenous ecological knowledge, Taoist philosophy, Zen Buddhism, Hindu understandings of harmony with nature, and Western alchemical traditions that viewed transformation as cooperation with natural processes. So many people think cultivation is simply a technical process, but experienced growers often describe it as developing a relationship with a living organism. How has cultivating fungi changed your own perspective on nature, patience, and responsibility?
I think cultivating fungi is one of the coolest things you can do. And I think that it's never been easier right now. Like, it can definitely be a steep learning curve. Like, I'm not a great cultivator myself, but what I've learned is that there are many resources available to people to make it easier to cultivate. And I think that's really the defining characteristic of this era of the psychedelic zeitgeist, is that people talk about, oh, the government might shut it down if we don't all get in line and walk straight and toe the company line or whatever. But it's like, you can't shut it down now because it's been democratized. Cultivation of mushrooms has been crowdsourced. And when you think about the 1960s, when people say like the psychedelic era got shut down, it's like, how many people do you know making their own LSD? Not very many. I'm sure somebody's doing it, but really not very many. Completely different ballgame and story than hundreds of thousands all over the world, people cultivating mushrooms. It's so simple. You can buy the spores anywhere. I could shout out so many different people. You could shout out like Full Canopy Genetics is an award-winning company in Colorado. There's tons of different companies where you can get the genetics and you get the substrate. Booming Acres, great one-stop shop. There are so many different providers that are fully compliant within the laws. You're not even stretching the law. It's like, for anybody who's unfamiliar, psilocybin mushroom spores actually in their spore state contain 0 psilocybin. So the DEA itself, Drug Enforcement Administration, has even clarified that spores, mushroom spores, aren't criminalized. They don't contain any scheduled substances or anything. So that's why if you go on a website, it'll be for microscopy use only or for research use only. And to be fair, there are a lot of people that just use them for microscopy purposes. Like there's a whole nerd community just studying mushrooms, looking at spores, documenting spores, etc. So point being that now anybody can cultivate. You could be a suburban mom in Denver or Milwaukee or whatever, and you can cultivate. And that was not the case before. So I think in terms of like building a relationship with the fungi, that's another angle. I think to look back at like mushrooms as an intelligent entity, I think too often it's portrayed in the media as something that you just consume, you take. That's a very extractive relationship. I think a true relationship is you build a relationship with the fungi, you learn about them. How do you learn about them? You cultivate them. And not just psilocybin or psychoactive fungi, there's so many different culinary mushrooms. Like you mentioned lion's mane earlier, right? Like there's a huge amount of tradition in different cultures, like in Chinese medicine, going back thousands of years with mushrooms like reishi and lion's mane. And you mentioned turkey tail. And like you can cultivate so many different types of mushrooms. There are culture banks and people cultivating like 160 different types of mushrooms that they have. So there are many, 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 many different types of mushrooms, and learning about that is great. And you can start with materials that you get from Costco or from like Home Depot or whatever. You get a mono tub, you get some cocoa coir. You know, there's companies like I mentioned that will make it easier. Like you can turnkey, just go to Booming Acres, Full Canopy Genetics. Boom, you're the guy now. You're the person who can cultivate. But point being that I think that takes it to the next level. And certainly for me, like cultivating your own mushrooms takes it to the next level for sure. And if you don't know how to do it, there's lots of forums, there's lots of different communities you can join. You can tap in with Mycopreneur. And as many people say as sort of a disclaimer, like they might teach you how to grow oyster mushrooms or grow some kind of like very culinary mushroom. Those same skills transfer over to other kinds of mushrooms, right? And the last thing I want to say as far as like the bigger doses, that's really I guess I had my aha moment at the lower doses, but the bigger doses are where the rubber meets the road, I think. And I also think it's not a bad idea. Like you don't start off riding a downhill bike at 60 miles an hour down a volcano, right? Like you start off with training wheels. And I think that's where you take the lower dose, kind of, oh, I'm comfortable. Okay. And then you taper up a little bit and you're like, oh, okay, I took a bigger dose and I feel really comfortable. And then you can go for the macro dose. And I think that's where the real intel is, but I would not go straight into that as a first timer. And I take my time, and I'm pretty vocal about that.
Yeah, just like if you're, once you turn 21, you're trying alcohol, you may start with beer, move to wine, move to liquor. You don't go straight to Everclear or the like. So I think that's an important distinction. But like you said, and unlike alcohol, I think there's a lot of transformative states that can be reached with these higher doses that are very important in terms of merging one's self-conscious reality with the total objective reality and moving the Atman to the Brahman in Hindu speak or whatever the case may be. And then just going back to cultivation, I know in 1976, culturally, a lot of the knowledge about psilocybin mushrooms and the growing process came from a book called The Psilocybin Mushroom Grower's Hand Guide, published by S.E.E.K and Ulrich, which was later identified as a pseudonym for Terence McKenna and his brother Dennis McKenna. And they chose those last names, S.E.E.K and Ulrich. You mentioned Jonathan Ott, to appear before him in any kind of manuals that distributed or disseminated information regarding psychedelics. So I think that's another fascinating kind of parallel. And in that book also, he mentions Edidorpa. That's a great introduction. He goes further into Edidorpa and other psychedelic stories, the origins of mushroom use in the Americas in archaic revival. He mentions the Monsieur Among the Mushrooms, Food of the Gods, and some other books of his as well. So do you have any thoughts on Terence McKenna or any other authors that you found exceptionally valuable to your spiritual search?
Yeah, Terence McKenna was the big dog for me, for sure. Like I was interested already in altered states, but I didn't really have experience with them. I did personally, my first like psychoactive or true psychedelic experience was with cannabis, which I feel like people overlook that, but like my early cannabis experiences, I had full-on close-eyed visuals of geometric patterns and really therapeutic experiences with like low doses of cannabis. I feel like everybody's different, but once you activate that inner landscape, that sense of like, I can close my eyes and put on headphones. In that case, I was using headphones, listening to music, and there's a whole interior universe here of space. That's really when the switch gets flipped, right? I feel like we're so often looking we're looking at things outside, but for me, it was cannabis that showed me like, I got a whole interior world. And then mushrooms really amplified that. And it was Terence McKenna that really put language to what I was thinking or feeling, right? It's the sense of, I know that there's something here with these esoteric experiences, these entheogenic experiences. I was reading on Arrowhead, reading trip reports. I was hearing from my friends. But what Terence really did for me and for a lot of people is he took a sense of being a very intelligent, very attuned person in Western culture who could put a name to a lot of these experiences. Because, for example, when people talk about like ayahuasca and the shamans in Peru, it's like, that's not my culture. I've experienced it. I've been fortunate to go down, but like, I don't understand the Siberian shamanism but like Terence was saying it in plain English, right? Of like, this is what's happening. And it was just fascinating at the time. Like, I do think now in retrospect, having the benefit of like hindsight, right? Like he was probably a little bit more uppity in terms of like maybe a little bit romantic and ideological. Why wouldn't you be though when you had that? Like in terms of, I do like to do some satire, which I hope we get into talking about, where like I've done a piece a few times of like Terence McKenna versus the future, where it's like Terence talking about things that are coming, in the 2000s through the I Ching and then this and that. It's like, we haven't really evolved that way. Like there's certainly been some cool stuff that's happened, but like, I'd be so curious to hear what he would have to say if he was actually alive today, right? So, but like Food of the Gods was a game changer for me because again, he was talking about these high doses, visual experiences. And I think what it did for me was take sort of the concern and the fear away about doing a big dose. Or I was like, oh yeah, I think I'd already had like I mentioned, like a half-eighth and then a 3.5 gram dose. And now there's so many strains of mushrooms that almost means nothing. But at the time, it was like you could pretty much only get golden teachers, which are like a standard dose in my community in San Diego at that time. So after I had like 3.5 grams and I felt very comfortable and like I had the body high and I got some visuals, then I was like, oh, I don't feel that intimidated by 5 grams or by, and of course it hit really hard. But again, I felt like I had already kind of trained for it, where I've been like, I did a small dose and then I did a medium-sized dose and then I did another medium-sized dose. And this is spread out over probably a year or whatever. And then by the time I hit that high dose, which actually was 7 grams my first time, you're at least kind of prepared for it, as opposed to like, and I was in my room in darkness. Like I told myself, like, Terence really helped kind of butter me up for that, or like grease the wheels. I had read it, and I think one of his main focal points he said is like, trust yourself, go for it, do the big dose. You can't afford not to do it, like if you want to know. And I feel very fortunate at the time of my life. I was in very good physical and mental state and things like that, and that's one other thing, a big conversation briefly that's come up recently is about like, how should we deal with this stuff now that psychedelics are popular with like kids, because like, for example, I was 17 and like, would I tell a 17-year-old to do it? Probably not. But I would also say, like, you got to know yourself. You got to be forthright and transparent with your community, hopefully. And I felt it was like a perfect time in my life. I was getting ready to go to college. It opened up my mind in a big way. But again, I think that the world's very different now. And like, I don't know how I would advocate for someone to do it at that time. But so Terence was huge for me. Jonathan Ott was also a big influence, I mentioned, because he was also very contrarian, very kind of skeptical of authority. And he maintained that until he died last year. And I got to meet him twice, if not 3 times. I spent a week with him right before he died. I think I have his last recorded lecture that I recorded. It was like 6 months before he passed away. It was in 2024. I think he died either in late 2024 or 2025. But it was like his last public appearance. And, he was very skeptical of the direction things are heading, of the corporatization and the medicalization. And he was encyclopedic with his knowledge. So he really attracted me with just like the thoroughness and his dedication to his craft, writing about not just one psychoactive like mushrooms, but he hated the word psychedelic. Honestly, he talked off. That was where his last few talks were about. Was like, I don't like the word psychedelic. Like it's, there's so many different experiences. Like, are you talking about a microdose of mushrooms or a 5-MeO DMT, or are you talking about peyote? Like they're radically different experiences. Psychedelic to him was a word that ended in the 1960s. It was a word bound to a time and place. So, I don't want to speak for him, obviously, but Terence McKenna, huge impact. Jonathan Knott, big impact. Those were probably the two most impactful writers in terms of when I was first getting into psychedelics. There's a lot more since then, but those were big ones early on.
And you mentioned the I Ching in the invisible landscape. I know Terence McKenna talks about the I Ching, these 64 hexagrams, this cosmological correspondence to these different outcomes. And it's a very fascinating read. I know that book has gotten some cultural criticism for some of the other ideas about the time wave zero theory and some other things in that book, but he does have some incredible touches of truth even throughout writings that may be ahead of their time in a lot of ways. And then also some people just have a gift of language, whether it's Albert Hofmann describing the LSD experience or Aldous Huxley describing his mescaline experience in The Doors of Perception, the sequel Heaven and Hell, or Terence McKenna with psilocybin mushrooms. It is a fascinating gift. And when you come across somebody who can articulate this ineffable space with such clarity, such vocabulary dense wording, and just really relatable, it really does humanize the experience. It makes it so that people who haven't had it are very curious, innately interested. They don't have this fear. It kind of dispels some of that societal pressure that's been put on them. So kind of segues into the next question. Entheogenic fungi have documented ceremonial use among the Mazatec, Mixtec, Zapotec, Chinantec, and several other indigenous cultures of Mesoamerica. Scholars have also investigated possible mushroom symbolism surrounding the Eleusinian mysteries, the Vedic Soma, early Christianity, in the book Psychedelic Gospels by Jerry and Julie Brown, prehistoric rock art, ancient Egypt, and numerous shamanic systems, although many of these hypotheses remain debated. What is broadly accepted is that visionary fungi have served as sacred sacraments within multiple cultures, often functioning as catalysts for healing, divination, initiation, and religious experience. This raises fascinating questions about the relationship between biology, culture, and spiritual experience. So as someone immersed in both the cultivation and the broader history of fungi, how do you view the evidence that mushrooms have played important roles in humanity's religious and ceremonial spiritual systems?
I honestly don't spend too much time thinking about it, but I would have to imagine that something so impactful that grows all over the planet, that people would have figured it out at some point. You think about our ancestors and they're trying different things and they have intimate knowledge of the environment. And like, that's one thing about psilocybin mushrooms that's really fascinating among many. They grow everywhere. Like there's native psilocybe species all across Africa, all across Mesoamerica, all across the United States, all across Europe, all over the place. And we haven't even talked about like Amanita. That's a whole other species. That's a whole other thing. And they're all over the place. So of course people would have figured this out. And like, for example, scholars maintain for years that like only in southern Mexico or Mesoamerica was there a traditional use of psychoactive fungi. Like, that's just not accurate. I mean, even in the last couple of years, if not the last year itself, there's been evidence of different healers, diviners in like Lesotho in South Africa who have used different species of mushrooms. I've heard from people in Serbia that like there's a psilocybe cerbica, I think it's a type of mushroom that like indigenous healers in Serbia know how to use this stuff. You hear about like in New Zealand, there's a clinical trial underway using native mushrooms, the psilocybe Wiraroa, it's called, and that the healers there know about these mushrooms and use them. And like, for example, there was I think it's called the Tohunga Suppression Act of 1907, where indigenous knowledge and plant knowledge and healing was suppressed and people were burned or killed. So it's just a little bit ironic for scholars now to be like, there's no evidence of psilocybe use around the world, even though for 400 to 500 years, people were quite literally burned at the stake and tortured if they knew how to do it. So like, of course, they're not going to be out in your face that these people know how to do it. But again, just that example of like in Lesotho and in South Africa, that there are healers who use these mushrooms and they've been doing it for generations. And according to them, since pre-colonial times. I remember another interesting thing, like R. Gordon Wasson, who of course broke the story about the magic mushroom of Cuautla and Maria Sabina and things like that without her permission in Life magazine in 1955. He also traveled to other parts of the world to investigate, and also has written about entheogenic fungi use in Borneo and Papua New Guinea. And again, in both of these places, there's psilocybe mushrooms. So as far as like the tradition of it, I mean, there's a lot of rock art that it sure looks like they're mushrooms to me in parts of Africa. And you'll see even things like in early Christian art of it's really open to interpretation. Like I think I'm not a scholar. I haven't devoted my whole life to studying this, but like those look like mushrooms to me. If you look at these early Christian art pieces, they might be amanita. And then if you just think about in terms of like the allegory of like the Adam and Eve and the fruit of knowledge, like it's not an apple, dude. Like, come on, there's so many other examples in the mushroom world or plants of like the divine knowledge, things that are beyond the pale of ordinary human understanding. So there's a lot of examples of that. There's also a lot of different kinds of psychoactive cacti, which I think is really interesting. Like people are probably familiar with mescaline, probably familiar with peyote or San Pedro, but there's actually tons, or maybe not tons. There's probably like a dozen, if not close to that, different types of psychoactive cactus. So again, those are just a few off the cuff of like, I'm sure that this stuff was known throughout history. And if we look at the examples of the suppression, like you mentioned the name Sahagan, I think earlier, right? Of like the Spanish friar, like they were killing and torturing people for knowledge of mushrooms. So like, why would we think that it's just readily available? The Mayan codices, they were burned. There's like 3 or 4 and one's disputed if it's real, but like at least 3 Mayan codices. But there were many, like I think Sahagan himself mentioned in Merida. It wasn't him actually, it was another friar, but in the Mexican city of Merida, there was a bonfire in like the 1700s where they just burned tons of manuscripts. So like how much of that knowledge, and you look at the fire in Alexandria, right, in the library of Alexandria, Egypt, there were tons of books lost there. So like if you have a multi-century long suppression and torture campaign that's targeting indigenous knowledge, are you going to be shocked that there's not a lot of clear examples of like easily traceable history? But of course, this was a big part of the history.
Great points. And going back, yeah, if you look in Tassili in Ager in Algeria, you have the bee-faced shaman, the mushroom runner. I know Alex Gray has depicted these in art form. If you look in Spain, you see the Selva Pascuala cave, these mushroom figures, Psilocybe hispanica, that are also next to this bull, this lunar symbolism. And then as you move onward, like you were mentioning, R. Gordon Wasson, yeah, aside from, he has the books, The Wondrous Mushroom, Mazatec Mushroom Velata, both of those focus on psilocybe species, but his cornerstone book was this Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality. And within this story, he talks about the Vedic Soma. In the Rig Veda, they talk about this mysterious substance that causes immortality, communion with gods, this heightened sense of perception, awareness. And he theorized that to be this Amanita muscaria mushroom. It's analogous to the Zoroastrian Hauma. There's linguistic, etymological origins. And it's fascinating to me. Terence McKenna later said that he didn't think it was Amanita muscaria. He thought it was a psilocybe species. And R. Gordon Wasson himself, self-admittedly, could not ever have a visionary experience with Amanita. He traveled to Japan. He had 30 days where he was cooking it, drying it, doing all these different techniques, but he could never have this visionary experience. And it could be argued the one thing that he didn't try was consuming his own urine, which is a taboo topic, but Siberian shamans, they were said to either consume urine of people who had eaten the mushroom or reindeers who had consumed the Amanita muscaria in order to have their visionary experiences. And scholars like Robert Forte in Entheogens and the Future of Religion, he documented how he only was able to have the experience through this consumption of urine. And R. Gordon Wasson didn't try that, and I'm not sure Terence McKenna did either, but I do tend to lean toward, it was likely in my mind a psilocybe species. It could have been a combination in terms of the color descriptions and everything else in the Rig Veda and the Zoroastrian Avesta. Could be a combination of Amanita and psilocybe species, but regardless, I think it's fascinating just to look back across the global historical record and see how important fungi have been across human history. It is really something to marvel at.
Amanita muscaria, it does not get the respect it deserves. And I was always a bit skeptical, as one is. And like even people like Paul Stamets, he's like the mushroom guy. He's gone on Joe Rogan and been like, oh, don't do that. It's dangerous. I wouldn't do that if I were you. And he's actually changed his tune recently. I saw him at Telluride Mushroom Festival last year, which I'll be at again in August. It's the longest running mushroom festival in the United States since early 80s. And Paul Stamets was actually one of the founders. But last year he talked about how like there's clinical trials going on. There's research into muscimol and the whole psychoactive component. It's like, it's definitely not the same as psilocybin mushrooms. It also is a magic mushroom. And because this term magic is very broad, but I personally have had great experiences. I got to shout out Amintara, Amentara, Amintara. They're the best, the biggest importers and distributors in the United States. They hit me up and they're like, hey man, like you want to try some of these? We'll walk you through it. Definitely start off as a microdose, read the blogs, go through everything. It's really great for sleep. That's what a lot of people use it for. I have a hard time shutting down my, you would call it default mode network, right? Like I have an internal monologue, hard to sleep, puts me to sleep right away. I ended up accidentally taking too much one night. It was a total accident. I meant to just take a little dropper and then the dropper didn't fill up. So I was like, oh, there's not that much left. I drank it. It was quite a bit of this bottle of this tincture. And it ended up giving me a really intense, visionary, completely psychedelic lucid dream where I was sleepwalking. I learned later that's a characteristic of Amanita is that people sleepwalk, but it flipped my script 100% of the way I think about this stuff. And so my point being that there's clearly been historical use. I mean, the word, it's like mushroom of drunkenness, I think etymologically it translates to, it goes back like 7,000 years in Siberia. Like they knew that this mushroom imparts an intense experience to people. It's been used all over the world. And I think now it's just about figuring out how to use it. You don't eat it raw out of the ground like you can a psilocybin mushroom. You want to decarboxylate it. You want to cook it down. You mentioned the reindeer pee. That's one of the theories is that decarboxylates it so that when people drink it, it's essentially a treatment process. But the same thing happens if you boil it in tea. It's a thing that you want to do your homework on. You don't want to go into that one blind because you can definitely have a sick, it can make you nauseous or sick. But I've had great experiences with it with just a little bit of know-how. And I really think more and more people are turning onto it now because there's more knowledge about it, more anecdotal knowledge. And I'm passing it along to everyone now that like, I've done it many, many times, especially in low doses and had great experiences. I had one high dose experience and it was so impactful. It's like, I don't really want to go back to it. I'm not seeking out another high dose experience, but it's enough for, I woke up, it was fine. Next day, I actually did a podcast at 10 a.m. the next day. It wasn't like it wiped me out forever, but it was really intense. So I would work up to that and do your homework before you do a high dose.
Thank you for sharing. And for people that don't know, in Siberia, the Koryak people, the Evenki people, other systems there, the Yakut, I believe, they all utilize this Amanita muscaria mushroom. It's gone back many, many millennia. And it was first written about, I think, in the 1800s, brought to Western awareness through English authors and explorers. The active compounds, ibotenic acid and muscimol, like you were saying, both do interact with the body in different ways than psilocybin, psilocin from psilocybe species. How would you briefly summarize the distinction between the experience with psilocybin mushrooms and those of Amanita?
I don't think there is a correlation between the experience. I think that, if anything, I guess there's a body high that accompanies both. So, but mentally, my first experience with Amanita was not preferable. I was at a party and I took a gummy because there's also the issue where people are making synthetic products and things like that, which I don't think is inherently bad. But again, I'm a psychonaut with many years of experience, and I took this Amanita gummy at a party and I went home. I was just like, I am just not into it right now. And then I woke up still high. And it was like this incredible body high. It wasn't like a thing you'd want to repeat. But then I recognized I was at a party and so when I had the chance to do this stuff with Amintara and they sent me some mushrooms and they sent me a whole good, hey, read this, look at this. And I tried very small doses, which I think they were capsules of a half gram, something like that, of ground up Amanita powder, decarboxylated Amanita. It was great. And it was for sleep. And I would often have intense dreams, really beautiful dreams, and still have deep sleep. It wasn't one or the other. It's I sleep really well and I have intense dreams and I wake up and I love that. That's great. It didn't impact my life. It was beneficial. And yeah, so it didn't negatively impact my life. It positively impacted my life. So that's it. But I would say it's not a thing you want to take Like I mentioned, psilocybin mushrooms, I took them at a fair the first time. I've taken them at many concerts. I would not do that with Amanita. I would take Amanita when I'm like in a place to take it, and not at a concert with a bunch of external stimuli or whatever. But I really don't think there's any overlap currently that I see.
Thank you sincerely for sharing your insights. Let's keep moving on. Universities around the world are investigating psychedelic compounds in relation to depression, anxiety, addiction, end-of-life distress, post-traumatic stress, neuroplasticity, and the neuroscience of consciousness. At the same time, philosophers continue debating the so-called hard problem of consciousness, while historians of religion compare contemporary reports with mystical experiences described throughout Hinduism, Buddhism, Christian contemplation, Sufism, Jewish mysticism, Indigenous spiritual systems, and Greek mystery religions. The convergence of neuroscience, psychology, anthropology, and comparative religion represents one of the most interdisciplinary conversations of our time. So modern research into psychedelic mushrooms has expanded dramatically during the past decade. Like you had mentioned, students are using these, younger people are using these. Where do you see the most exciting intersections between rigorous science and humanity's oldest questions about consciousness?
Yeah, great question. I'm also a little bit skeptical of it myself, of trying to flatten narratives to fit them into academic prerogatives. And this is being said as someone, for example, I went to school in University of San Francisco, next to the Haight, very psychedelic forward culture. And there was no mention whatsoever. And it was like not allowed to talk about psychedelics. And this is like just over a decade ago. So the idea that like now more and more institutions are going to introduce this, it's to me a little bit questionable, where I'm skeptical of the whole embrace of polite culture, polite society, professional, academic, medical psychedelics, because it's like, wow, you reverse course real quick. Like for years, we were pariahs. If you were interested in mushrooms or psychedelics, you would be kicked out of school or put in the back of a police car or extricated from society and excommunicated. And now we've got like religious organizations and professional organizations and police unions looking at it. And I think there needs to be a sort of a reckoning of like, what do you mean we're supposed to put our stock in what the government is saying is the correct way to go? Because the government's really the one who launched the war on drugs in the first place. And we just reverse course so fast. I'm a little bit skeptical. I do think there are people with their heart in the right place who are doing good work. But I also think, don't get it twisted, that like people, you do a course and you get to check the boxes and now you're a professional psychedelic researcher. Like I actually think it potentially sets the stage for a lot of harm. I think that there's a lot of like, okay, I'm new to this and I just found out about it and I enrolled in this course and now I'm going to make content about it. And I question some of that personally. Maybe I'm a little bit jaded because, again, like when I was interested in it and it was very clearly like a big deal at the time, and I stuck my neck out there. And like, for example, in 2020, when I really launched my public facing platform, it was still heresy. When I did Mycopreneur in 2020, we had people telling us like, oh, you're going to get arrested and you're doing this wrong. And this is, oh, you should be very careful about it. And that was 5 years ago, 6 years ago. So like the fact that everyone's normalized it so quick, I just think it's worth a word of caution. I think you should do your own research, do your own homework. I do think that you should, if you're interested in it, like check it out. If you're a student, you should probably study, but sometimes people conflate this academic pedagogy with expertise. And I think that's not the case. I think that you should be very skeptical of that personally. And so I guess that's my take on that in particular. And I do think there should be some real world experience you have, and people who have that experience, like we should be fighting for cognitive liberty. Like this idea that you're going to do this in a clinic and it's going to be patented and it's controlled. It's very myopic and short-sighted. And I think it doesn't, you get a lot of people who, now that it's in vogue, they'll jump into it because it's cool. But it's like none of the psychonauts, none of the people who built this culture in the West and who have inherited it and furthered it from prior cultures, nobody was asking for permission. They were doing it in explicit violation of social norms. So again, I just think I'd be wary, I'd be skeptical of thinking that these social norms that are in place now, people watch a couple of videos on YouTube and they have an experience and then they jump on it. I always like to say, like, dude, I didn't have a public facing opinion until probably like 14, 15 years after like I had deep personal experience. So just think about like, and I always like to circle back to this, like, dude, now I got a kid. I've been married for 10 years. I've got a nice position with what I've been doing with Mycopreneur. I've worked professionally in the world. Like, I just feel like you got to earn your opinion. And people sometimes conflate that with like, I took a couple of courses and now I'm a master's student in psychedelics. And maybe that works in a certain slice of the world, but let's be real. There's no accessible legal psychedelics right now. Like, you want to go pay tons of money. I mean, you could do a decrim city still, but even that's technically extra legal, like for the most part. Like, it's not explicitly covered by any kind of the regulatory system. Like, the whole point is that you can just do it without the regulatory system. So I'm very skeptical about when I see things like Atai or whatever, selling to Eli Lilly and I just feel like I see a lot of people with a lot of opinions on it, but it's mostly just parroting. It's like they heard somebody say something, they read something, and not a single person has been treated by that. Maybe a few in clinical trials, but like, we're very far off the mark, I think. I got a lot of thoughts about it. I'm still trying to also evolve my understanding. And I don't think we should not have these programs. I even thought about joining a master's program overseas at University of Exeter. They've got like a new psychedelic program they launched this year. I think that'd be rad. But I also think that one should have some humility and a little bit of healthy skepticism about trying to integrate these very ancient, profound experiences into, in what some ways are very narrow framework of the academic or medical system.
Great points. And when you take away this cosmological container, this hereditary wisdom, ancestral knowledge away from the sacrament, it does create this very sterile experience when you try to only frame it through a clinical lens. And I think it is important, without taking these things out of their cultural context, they would not be as accessible for a lot of people. But in doing so, you also create the problems of not passing along the experience with all of the information that may be relevant to have the deepest, not only experience, but the integration that follows thereafter. And you'd mentioned cognitive liberty. There's a controversial occultist, Aleister Crowley, but he said, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will." And that as long as you're able to do something with love as the engine that drives it, you should be free to explore your mind, explore your consciousness, not be dictated by these overarching organizational impressions of authority. And I think it's important to kind of meditate on that idea and realize that at one point in time, our will was taken from us, and the ability to search our soul, it was put in these constraints, these frameworks that may not be the best for humanity. And at some point, you may have to break free from those constraints, even though it's not legally sanctioned, as hard as that is to cognize. And then also, in my interview with Adam Mazio, we also talked about this divergence between science and the experience of psychedelics. And in the 60s, you see all these smiling hippies, these music festivals, everyone's enjoying themselves, having these laughter-filled experiences. And then after this 1970, 1971 Controlled Substances Act, President Nixon cracks down, society as a whole starts to view these things in a certain light that forces the scientific community to have to be extremely rigorous, but also very plain languaged, very serious in their delivery about why these things should be moved back to a experimental realm in terms of societal implications. On one hand, the seriousness is needed so that society can recognize that there are these potentials, but on the other side, I feel like the playful language, the humor surrounding these experiences, you mentioned satire, these things need to come back into the mainstream. You had authors like Robert Anton Wilson writing this satirical fiction, incorporating all these esoteric entheogenic themes. And at some point, our culture decided that you could no longer laugh about these experiences. They were very serious. They had to be in these serious therapeutic models. And it kind of robs the experience of this joy, this pervading, you mentioned ecstasy earlier, this unio mystica that can occur, this divine madness, theomania, everything that can happen in these spaces. It's not only serious contemplation, it's also just the recognition of how funny the modern world is because of the constraints that have been put on us and all this other stuff that it's hard not to laugh about. So I do appreciate you saying that. And then lastly, I don't know if you're familiar with Dave Hodges. You mentioned this movement now and the decriminalization efforts therein, and he formed the Church of Ambrosia. They had churches in both Los Angeles and San Francisco. I think one of the branches closed, but I watched an interview with him. He talks about how the majority of his life now is dedicated to the legal implications. He said that he has to be ready at all times to be rated by the DEA. He's constantly just legally trying to structure himself so that he's not condemned to the fate, like Timothy Leary. And when he was going from Texas to Mexico, I believe, he was carrying cannabis. They ended up, getting him for that and then putting him in jail for years. And he had to have this legal battle to get back out. And then he decided, hey, I'm not gonna let them see me with a serious face and show them that they won by imposing this on me, when I know that, I was within my freedoms to do what I was doing, explore my mind, explore my soul. I don't know if you have any thoughts on Dave Hodges and the Church of Ambrosia.
I love Dave. He's great. He's a good friend of mine. And, I've never actually been out to the church, but I see him all over the place when I'm out and about. And he's a big character, and he's got something really interesting that he's built. And I do think there's a lot of grounds for constitutional protection for entheogenic use in churches, because it is a divine experience for many people. And for example, a lot of the people I associate with, like, these are professionals, dude. You know what I mean? It's like, these are people with standing in their community, and they've got kids and they've got careers. And like, it's heresy to think of like somebody like that getting in trouble because they're interested in mushrooms, when like they're contributing valuable members of society. And I don't want to sound like an elitist. Like, I do think everybody should have the right to do this, but my whole take on it is like, hey, if you take this substance, you're into mushrooms or DMT or whatever it is, if you take that and you do bad, you're responsible for the bad. But like, many of these people that in my life I've seen, they're like, I mentioned professionals, they're lawyers, they're professors, they're journalists. It's like, why not just give these people the space to do that? And so my whole take on, like, with Dave is, you build this space, you should have some kind of protection and a carve out. And I think in general, it's easy to condemn the war on drugs because I think it's a waste of resources, but it's also naive, I think, to imagine that it's just going to end like this. You look at the DEA, it's a multi-billion-dollar federal agency. It's like, I just don't see it going away overnight. I think people have a pie in the sky vision of like, you might be able to challenge them, and I think you should. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't challenge that, but I really think something like the church model makes a lot of sense, and that can be stretched for sure. Like, I think in earnest that a religious protection or a model, the whole point should be that you really are a community and you have a sense of protection and you have a sense of relationship and connection. And so I can understand why somebody, if they think it's operating more like a dispensary, why they would not want that. But I just think it's crazy. And maybe this is why there's non-enforcement. You see a lot of non-enforcement. Like, there's a ton of mushroom brands, dude. There's a ton of churches. There's a ton, because again, like, what a waste of resources to be like, this person is a homeowner with kids who golfs, who's like an upstanding member of their community, and they like microdosing. That's the target we're going to focus on. That's ridiculous, I think. So, and again, I always like to qualify my statements with like, I'm also still learning and thinking. It's not like I have all these answers. Funny enough, a lot of people peg me as like an expert, but it's like, I really got my stature, quote unquote, in this community by taking the piss out of it. Like, I definitely have written for serious platforms, and that's kind of how I started. But like, my main thing I'm known for that I love is satire and jokes. So it is funny to like try to answer questions seriously, because like, that's kind of my focus right now. Is like, I think satire, in the same way that psychedelics are very ethereal and enigmatic and unique and like ineffable, as you said earlier, satire is similar. Like, comedy and humor is similar. So if I could join those two and apply it to like really intense situations, because like, think about just the news in general. And if you can find a way to portray that in a light that's a little bit more human, dare I say, and you can do that and it lands, which is tough to do, which I will say other people do it. The Onion does it, Babylon Bee does it, other satirists do it, other comedians do it. That kind of got me to the next level. And all of a sudden I started getting bigger invitations, and then, MAPS hit me up. They're probably like, at that point, the preeminent organization, where like this was right before the whole MDMA situation with Lycos and all that. This was like 2022 again. And they hit me up and they're like, hey, we want you to speak at our conference. And I was like, I've never even heard of you guys. Who are you? Who vouches for you? Who art thou? And then they were like, okay, well, you should come, and we want you to come, and just like, here's the application, just fill it out, but you're already in. And I straight up wrote on my application for the Psychedelic Science Conference in 2023 that I was raised as a tightrope walker in Kazakhstan, and I became the #1 tightrope walker. And then I had an unfortunate incident with a bear, and it sidelined my career. And then they put me on like a main stage, with like a huge room of people. So again, I just think that's where it comes back to like having a sense of humor and humility about it, to be like, I could sit here and yap about like I'm some expert, but like I really just found my lane. And that was not overnight. It was like a 10-year overnight sensation, as people call it, where like I had been thinking about this, I'd been interested in psychedelics, doing a lot of psychedelics for a long time. And then it just, right place, right time, it came up. But so I always like to walk that back, because again, I think there's been this culture of like expertise and professionalism. It's like, I'm not that. Like, I certainly have my thoughts, but like my main focus, like I say, tomorrow is like, how am I going to make people laugh tomorrow and wake up and enjoy my life? Because that's what my integration is all about. It's not about being the guy. It's about being like, how can I add value to people's lives, have fun, wake up feeling pretty good, wake up feeling good about it. And that's what I focus on.
Humor really is one of God's greatest gifts to humanity, and people that can cultivate that and relate to the biggest number of people, bring joy, lighten the stress of samsara, or this cycle of suffering in these Eastern philosophies. That's how they define it. It really is a beautiful gift. And so I do thank you for your contributions there. I did read that you spoke at Harvard Business School. I would be interested to hear what you talked about there. What was the topic?
That was awesome. It was Harvard Law School. It was the Petrie Flom Center. And they got a grant from one of the board members, I think from SpaceX, this guy, Antonio Gracias, I want to say is his name. And he's a billionaire. He gave him like a $40 million grant. So they've been doing a lot of psychedelic programming. And I got invited to this seminar. So I didn't actually do the speaking, but I did get to participate in sort of an invite-only colloquium where they had people, and it was really interesting because they had people from the DEA, FDA, VA, probably a whole lot of other alphabet agencies, but that was kind of the tune in the room. And what I really noticed from that is that there was a lot of people who had zero experience with psychedelics, who were somehow put in a position of making decisions about psychedelics. And that's another thing I sort of was outspoken against, because like I was there, I wore like a cannabis tailored suit I bought in Thailand, and I sat next to a dude from the DEA, it's like wearing his suit. And I realized like a lot of these folks just don't know what they're talking about, and they're not even willing to own that. They think because you've been involved in cannabis policy or something, now you have the expertise where you could speak about psychedelics. I get that political policy is one thing, but I'm very skeptical of, and I've kind of been proven right a lot for a long time on this kind of stuff, to be like, you don't know what you're talking about. And it's very clear. It's very upfront, apparent. And, even for example, like one of the people involved with the organization of that, like had a weekly newsletter about psychedelics, and just like did it for like a year, and it hasn't published in the last like 2 years. And I think there's going to be a lot of that happening, where like people jump in, they see like, this isn't the same as what I'm used to. Like, for example, huge news recently in the psychedelic space was Atai Beckley selling to Eli Lilly for $2.8 billion. A lot of people are posting about what a strong signal it is. It's like, I don't think people really grasp. They don't understand the nuances and the dynamics of a deal like this, where they sold that for peanuts. Like that's not a big deal at all. Like if anything, they bought it to shelve it, But I think a lot of people want to save face, or you get put in a position where you're asked to be an authority. I have a lot of thoughts about it, but I felt like I chimed in a lot there, and I waited sort of like I was there for 3 days. And like the last day I kind of talked a lot, and like, because I have a lot of experience with this stuff, and also how it actually works pragmatically in the world for a long time. So I'm skeptical a little bit, like if, somebody, you're like, how many, not to say everybody has to have personal experience, but it goes a long way. I think it'll humble you a little bit if you've had some personal experience, but I just think there's a lot of that, like I was in cannabis, or I was in this position, and now psychedelics is the next thing. I'm like, no, it's not. Like you can go as fast, as hard, as big, as public as you want, and you might be heading in the wrong direction, right? Like game recognized game, and I didn't recognize a lot of game in that room for sure.
That is very interesting. And I was wondering, do you have any interest in ever doing an indigenous ceremony with the Siberian people with Amanita, or Iboga with the Bwiti, or peyote with the Huichol, mushrooms with the Mazatec? Do you have any inclination to want to experience these things within these ceremonial contexts, or are you okay not having those experiences and allowing your own experiences to be the experience, so to speak?
Yeah, so I've done 2 veladas with the Mazatec with Maria Sabina's family, so I have a sense of what that's like. I'd be interested in like Siberian ceremonies, you said, with mushrooms, but like I've been invited to a lot of the other things. I've been invited to peyote ceremonies. I've been invited, or at least had the open door to go to the Bwiti in Gabon. It doesn't really call me right now. I've been invited for like all expenses paid to go do 5-MeO DMT at retreat centers, but like I think this comes from, I've experimented and tried a lot of different psychedelics over a long time. And then I found like mushrooms fit really well into my life. And like I mentioned, like I'm pretty established. Like who knows, maybe I'll change my mind in the future. But like I said, dude, I'm at a family barbecue right now with a bunch of kids. Like I've got a kid, more coming hopefully in the future. I've got my wife, we just bought a house. Like I'm just not really that motivated to like go discover another thing. And I think power be to people. I've done ayahuasca ceremonies. I've been to the Amazon 3 times. I've traveled to like probably 90 countries around the world, all 6 continents. I haven't been to Antarctica many times, to a lot of them. Africa 5 times, Europe 15 times, South America 10 times. So I've been very fortunate in that regard. And like I found something that works for me. So I'm not really like motivated to go do the other thing. And maybe I will, I'm always going to hold out the potential for like, yeah, of course, iboga sounds interesting, but like, what would it teach me right now? Like maybe it would have a lot to teach me. Maybe, I have no idea. But I know that mushrooms fit really well into my life. And that's the other thing is like, I went, like I mentioned, 3 times in a row, down to 3 years in a row, down to drink ayahuasca. And after the 3rd time, I was just like, why do I need to keep coming to do this? Like I'm so dialed in right now. It kind of, I think you get to a point, hopefully, Alan Watts says, if you get the message, hang up the phone. That's another thing I love about mushrooms. Like they kind of found me where I was. I didn't go anywhere to do them. Like they were in my neighborhood. My friends had them, and like they're all over the place. And something like iboga or ayahuasca, it's like there's this whole tradition tied up with them. But like, people like to write off mushrooms as like, oh, they rank them. People rank psychedelics. They're like, oh, 5-MeO is the strongest. No, iboga is the strongest. No, ayahuasca is the strongest. I'm like, bro, literally any altered state you enter, there are levels to it. Like you can take 20 grams of mushrooms. People don't want to talk about that, but like you can take huge doses of mushrooms and go have an off-planet experience. I'm sorry, how is that going to be any different than like, another intense experience? Oftentimes people are like, oh, that's too much. Don't do that. It's like, wait a minute. So it's cool to like fly over. They call it a flood dose of iboga. And like people take mini doses or micro doses of iboga. You take a flood dose that lasts for many hours. You ever taken 20 grams of dried mushrooms? Because it'll give you a full send for sure. People like to hierarchize and rank stuff. And, that's where I'm at with it. I just take my mushrooms, hang out with the family and friends. And like, I would hope everybody could come to a point in their life where they're like kind of just stoked on who they are.
I can appreciate that perspective for sure. You had talked at the beginning of this interview about the word entheogen, and that word came about because of this kind of recreational context of the 60s and trying to move away from that. Scholars Carl A.P. Ruck, R. Gordon Wasson, Albert Hofmann, and Jonathan Odd, as you mentioned, came to the conclusion that entheogen was this replacement that kind of hinted toward a more spiritually centric life. Do you think that we need to move away from this recreational, it doesn't sound like you do, but this recreational oriented, are there any dangers societally that only having the recreational mindset could provide, as opposed to having the entheogenic, this spiritually seeking oriented mindset? Is there anything that you want to say in terms of where you think that word should go, and just any kind of thoughts you have on this recreational versus spiritual use of entheogens in general?
I definitely would hope that people who feel called to it do a high dose in a contained, kind of spiritually focused manner, because that's clearly different if you do that than if you go party with friends. And like I mentioned, when I grew up with mushrooms around me or first encountered them, it was like people playing beer pong, eating mushrooms, right? Or like there was never a sense of like, we're going to do this in a focused manner. But then I fortunately had that experience because I had read Terence McKenna, and I did like a 7-gram solo dose in darkness. And that really sent me on to the next level. So I'm grateful I had that experience. But at this point, like, it honestly doesn't matter what we think other people should do. And that's part of the beauty of mushrooms being decentralized, is there's this sense, I always come back to this sort of metaphor of like the blind people touching the elephant, right? Where it's like the people touching the tail say like it's a rope, and then the people touching the trunk are like, no, it's a snake, and then the people touching the side go, no, it's like leather. It doesn't matter what we think because people can make their own decisions, and I think that's the beautiful part of it. And I do think going back to this intelligent entity bit, like mushrooms are intelligent and they'll tell people. You know, some people take them and they're like, I hated that. I know plenty of people that I'm close with that are like, that's another thing I like to talk about is like, a lot of my community are not psychonauts. Like I'm kind of like the outlier, you know, but they kind of like, oh, you've been doing it for a long time. We get it. And like, even with all this research, they're just not interested. You know, they're like, yeah, I don't care. I used to evangelize, be like, everyone needs to try this. No, I've totally changed. I'm not going to tell my wife or, you know, my brother or someone like, you have to do this. If they feel called, they want to do it, they should do it. But I think that this sense of like, it needs to be used this way, it needs to be used that way. It's like, says who? You know, says who? Like, if people want to try mushrooms, I've met plenty of people who have had a great experience on a low dose and it was fun for them and they enjoyed it and it benefited their lives. And that's great. And like, why would we ever say no to that? So no, and I think that's the beauty of home cultivation or it being crowdsourced. Is like no one gets to make that decision for you. You make that decision for yourself now. And the same, right? Like if somebody wants to eat big doses all the time, if they're not causing harm to anyone else, who cares? Like, who am I to be like, oh man, it's impacting your job. It's like, they probably don't even want that job. You know, just like you do what's called for you. If you cause harm to other people, if you break real laws, not these bullshit, you know, drug laws regarding to that, like, then we could talk. You know, if someone takes, you know, they always talk about like, oh, if they take it and they drive, it's like, yeah, well, if they do that, that's driving under the influence. That's breaking a law. But like, if somebody wants to take mushrooms and sit in their house and stare at the ceiling, like, who cares? I don't care personally. Yeah.
It's kind of going back to that Aleister Crowley quote, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will. Yeah, I appreciate you not wanting to state that people need to do things in a certain way, or people should be able to self-experiment with their consciousness in the ways that they see fit, as long as they're not harming anyone else and they have this sense of love for humanity as the driving force. You also mentioned high doses. I know Dave Hodges, the Church of Ambrosia, he discusses how he originated this idea in his head after having this 15 to 25 gram dose, and how these extremely high doses can have these extremely revelatory effects. He describes encounters with angelic beings and all kinds of sensory information that made him feel at one with the universe, interconnected in his ideas with the globe's ideas, and just allowed him to feel comfortable in starting the initiative that he did. And then lastly, you mentioned this blind man and the elephant. For those who aren't aware, in Jainism, there's a concept called Antavada, and it's just seeing things from different perspectives. In the story, yeah, people feel different parts of an elephant while they're blindfolded, and they're unable to come to terms with what the entire picture looks like. And in the same way, these spiritual systems around the globe, every fraction or fractal of this infinite Godhead manifests itself in a way that's still subjective when it's not viewed comparatively, and all these different systems can't be analyzed together. It's very difficult, especially in Orthodox systems, for people to come to terms with the totality of Godhead when they're only viewing it from this one certain angle. And in the same way as the Nekantavada, I do feel it takes this comparative perspective, really analyzing different spiritual systems, seeing the metaphor, the myth, the allegory, the symbol that underlie all of the spiritual experience around the globe, to kind of come to a more objective picture of deity, of the spiritual search and the like. Well, we've had a big back and forth. I'm going to kind of skip ahead to the last question I got, and then we can close it up however you see fit. The underground mycelial network connects ecosystems through extraordinarily complex relationships involving nutrient exchange, decomposition, symbiosis, and ecological balance. While popular discussions sometimes overstate these interactions, fungal ecology nevertheless illustrates how cooperation, adaptation, and interdependence shape living systems. Similar themes appear through Buddhist-dependent origination, Hindu concepts of interconnected existence, indigenous ecological worldviews, hermetic correspondences, as above, so below, Neoplatonic emanation, and modern systems theory. So the mycelial network has become a powerful metaphor for interconnectedness. Beyond this metaphor, what has studying fungi genuinely taught you about life, community, and the human condition? And what do you have to say for future seekers of psilocybin mushrooms or entheogenic experience that hasn't been stated thus far?
Here's the thing. I think with anything that's happening today, have some humility and take it slow. I think that the world today, and especially with social media and everything, encourages people to go really, really fast. You need to be an expert. You need to figure this out. You need to be someone. Man, that's a recipe for burnout. It's a recipe for charlatanism. I think that with anything, like, you should take your time. You should study it. You should wait. People will recognize that like you took your time to develop your craft, to learn about it. So as far as future seekers, take your time. There's no rush. Hopefully you're here for a long time. I've seen just in the last 5 years, dude, like so many companies, so many thought leaders, so many people come out. And if you don't have that good structure, that good foundation, you're going to crumble real quick, or you're going to get locked into something you're probably not really meant for in the long term. I think anything that hasn't changed. Like, take your time with it, learn about it. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't put yourself out there and you shouldn't take risks, but like, I think that it's important to take the long road, like it's the marathon. And I think that gets lost. It gets lost. We live in a dopamine culture. We live in a overnight expert, overnight authority culture, and that's not going to help anyone. So that's one thing. I think, like, yeah, take your time with everything. The most important thing, and what's really benefited me in the long run is be cool with everyone you come across as often as possible, dude. Like, be cool with your neighbors, help them, right? Find a way to provide value in your neighborhood, locally. Start with your local coffee shop. You can host a meetup. You can host a mushroom meetup. Like, a lot of the big names, quote unquote, in mushrooms, like, they have started out and worked like in their community for a long time. You don't just like leapfrog into this position of expertise. You work with your neighbors, you work with your family, you work with your friends. And then over time, that hopefully, if you're into it and you're cut out for it, like, that evolves into like a bigger platform. But I just think the world of social media tells people, like, you need to go viral now. You need to be a thought leader now. But take your time with it. Serve your local community. Yeah, I guess that's all I got right now, is just focus on that. And yeah, man, this has been really fun, just chatting, hanging out. You got a lot of cool art on your walls. I always appreciate that.
As you said, patience is a virtue, and I also think service is always the end goal, whether it's the bodhisattva ideal, the hero's journey, returning with this gift for humanity. I think you're doing your part in terms of bringing wisdom, humor, education, information to the general public who may not be aware of all these different connections across history, but also just the modern scene between science and this cultural use of these psilocybin mushrooms. So I really do appreciate your time. I appreciate everything you've said and shared. Is there anything else that we may not have gotten to that you wanted to touch on, or do you feel like this has been a complete interview?
It's been great. I think you're really good at what you do. And I just want to thank everyone for listening, and hit me up. I'm Mycopreneur. My name's Dennis Walker, but the platform is called Mycopreneur, Mycopreneur. And you can find me everywhere, and, come say what's up. Like, been doing this for a long time. I intend to do it for quite a bit longer. And, I never met someone who said, I wish I had one less friend. So I appreciate getting to know you, Nick. I also got to shout out Serenity Labs. They're partners of mine, SERENITE Labs. Check out Serenity Labs. They're doing game-changing work in regards to creating personalized protocols for different medicinal mushrooms. I really think that's the future, is a personalized medicine, and people building relationships with the medicine, and hopefully connecting with organizations and people who have done it for a long time. Because one thing I've noticed about mushrooms in particular is a lot of the mushroom community seems to be really cool with sharing resources, sharing intel, sharing knowledge. It's not like gatekeepy. It's not like people want to patent it and keep it behind a paywall. They want to share with you. And that's why the last thing I'll say is that every Thursday I host the Mycopreneur Incubator. I've been doing that for over 3 years. It's a free online Zoom call with other mushroom entrepreneurs and enthusiasts. So, like, we're having this conversation. We do the same thing every Thursday, and we'll bring in experts who have, built companies. Sometimes people who built like $100 million companies just come in and chill with 12 people and talk about, like, where things are going, where the puck's headed. And we have a really good core group, and we always have other people come. So that's every Thursday. It's a place for people interested in mushrooms, and more specifically, kind of my whole beat and platform is like mushroom entrepreneurs. Because again, I think that, like, you could be interested in mushrooms, and if you identify as a mushroom entrepreneur, you're putting skin in the game. You're putting money in, you're putting time, you're putting resources, and who doesn't want to be around other people who are doing that? There's plenty of people who are like, I quit my job to go all in on this, and this is your community. And other people say, that's my side hustle. I'm still working full time, but like, I want to do this in the future. And we got students, and like I said, we got everybody, publicly traded companies, things like that. So tap in with the Mycopreneur incubator. You can find the invite anywhere you find Mycopreneur stuff every Thursday.
You're gonna have to rope me into one of those Zoom calls. I'd love to be a part
Anytime,
of
yeah.
something. That'd be cool. I'm very interested in psilocybin, but also just the mycological implications of where all this stuff is going culturally, scientifically. I think it's just completely fascinating. So I'd love to be a part of that. You also mentioned personalized medicine. Before I was doing this, before I founded S.E.E.K, I was doing medical sales and surgical sales. We did PGX testing, pharmacogenetic testing. I do think it's important. It's hard to make a one-size-fits-all experience with these things. It's a very subjective experience. It has a lot to do with your memories, your understanding of reality, and personalizing these experiences can really make them much more appreciated by society as a whole. So I think that's important as well. And lastly, you mentioned the books and the art behind me. Everything is for sale at joinseek.org. Spiritual books, consciousness expanding artwork, courses coming soon. So check us out. Check out Mycopreneur. Reach out to him with any questions, comments. I'm sure he'll appreciate it. And again, I really just appreciate you taking the time today. It's been an eye-opening conversation, a mind-expanding conversation, a humor-filled conversation. So thank you again for your time.
Well, thank you, Nick. And again, thanks everyone for listening. And I really wish you the best, and let me know how I can support, because I really feel like the more of us who are having these kinds of conversations and doing this, that's what it's all about, man. I'm not an expert, but I do love to hang out with people, and I love to, pass on what I've heard. So like, I've learned a lot from you today, and I look forward to following more of what you're doing. So thank you, Nick.
A lot of the stuff that we talked about, I'm tracing the history of psychedelics throughout humanity from prehistoric times to the modern age. We've touched on all kinds of subjects. Look at our channel, follow those videos, go follow Mycopreneur, reach out to him. And again, one last thank you. I do appreciate your time, and hopefully we can talk again soon, maybe schedule another interview in the future.
Anytime. Cheers. Thanks, bro.